Thanks to Miguel and Rob for the invitation and for kindly facilitating the fact that I've got a bit of a dental problem. So I may be slushing water around my mouth. If you excuse me if I'm getting sloppy when I'm talking. In some sense, that was a very kind introduction from Miguel. In some sense, I was great, fascinating, and great to be amongst Philippe and Frank and Davor. I also feel that my expertise here is somewhat questionable in some sense. I spent a number of years trying to work through the implications of the Anthropocene for political geography with a number of colleagues, and that's what drew me to meet Miguel before. I was here a year and a half ago or so?
2015.
2015, well, time flies in the Anthropocene, for a kind of discussion which again brought together various people from social science and humanities, backgrounds to kind of look at the stakes of the Anthropocene. And one of the things that I got a little bit kind of frustrated with in those conversations was there was a lot of big claims around, let's say, the politics of the debate of the Anthropocene, the politics of the knowledge politics of the Anthropocene. I was involved in this myself. I still think it's very important, but eventually it got to the point where I was like, well, what is the Anthropocene actually doing somehow? I wanted a little bit more of a sense of like, how is this actually impacting how, let's say, practitioners think about policy, about law and so on. And that's what drew me eventually to the work of Frank and Philippe and others in this discussion of, say, Earth systems governance, Anthropocene governance, and how the Anthropocene is employed within, or mobilized within certain policy discourses. And in fact, I had engaged originally in kind of a lot of these discussions around, we were constantly being welcomed to the Anthropocene, but I was kind of thinking about whose Anthropocene is it? So what is it, who is it we're talking about, who is evoked in the name of the Anthropocene, and some of these questions around, let's say, the subject of the anthropos, it's questions of humanity and the kind of universalizing kind of tendency of the concept itself. And I had a research grant, or I won a research grant from the University of Zurich to actually kind of do a more kind of detailed discourse analysis of Earth systems governance. And I hope none of them are watching at the minute, because I ended up being kind of absorbed in another project, which is around extraplanetary extraction, or this speculative development of industries around asteroid mining, as Miguel mentioned. And that's kind of really taken up most of my time for the last about 9 months or so. And I haven't really engaged these materials for quite a while, but I nonetheless hope that I can make a useful contribution. And this, I don't know how many of you go to these numerous, almost endless at this point, Anthropocene symposia and conferences, but one of the standard, so let's say there's two kind of standard sets of images. One is the kind of satellite image of the Earth, some of which we saw in Frank's slides, and the other are these kind of more land surface images of the vast kind of spread of human infrastructures across land. And this image I kind of like to use when I'm teaching. It's an image of a refugee camp of Syrian refugees in Jordan from 2015. And it kind of gives a nice kind of little image of how kind of, let's say, geopolitical factors are being kind of involved in the kind of massive transformation of the environment and vice versa. So let's say specifically in my role as a political geographer, that's what Miguel and Rob had invited me to do, to give a bit more kind of critical perspective perhaps in some of these discourses and the perspective of political geography, and that's what I'll try and do. And I'll focus on Earth systems governance, and kind of tie that into some of the kind of key concerns of political geography. And so this is really dealing with the kind of project, the Earth Systems Governance Project, which led by Frank, which he mentioned already, but it also kind of some of the things emerged to a kind of broader discourses emerging around Anthropocene governance, not all of which are, of course, reducible in any way to Frank's project. And the kind of central point that I want to make is that, in some sense, and here I'm being quite polemical, let's say, to try and maybe get a bit of conversation going, that at the core, Earth systems governance and the discourse around it presents a paradoxically post-political politics. So Earth systems governance claims to bring Earth systems change and the Anthropocene into the domain of politics, claims to envisage more effective, more just, and more legitimate governance of Earth systems change, how we might change governance structures to account and for it, but yet in fact simultaneously depoliticizes the Anthropocene. In fact, simultaneously takes the Anthropocene out of politics. That's what I want to kind of provoke. claims to offer a political response to the Anthropocene, and in fact offers up a post-political Anthropocene. So what do I mean then by post-political politics? So there's an important distinction often or frequently made in political theory between politics on the one hand and the political on the other. Where politics is, let's say, the familiar stuff of politics, what we call politics in our everyday speech. It's the work of actors, states, parties, NGOs, international bodies, lobbies, unions, terrorist groups perhaps even, etc. And the negotiation and competition for power and the attempts to secure their interests of these different groups and to institutionalize those in various forms. The political, on the other hand, is a concept that indicates that which gives politics its specific character as politics, that what makes politics political. And there's various conceptions of how we might understand the political, that which makes politics political. But the one I want to employ here, and it's not the only one I think is valid or interesting, but it's useful to kind of put a bit of tension against Earth systems governance discourse as it is at the minute. This is a concept of the political defined by antagonism, by contestation between organized groups that can be considered political. So what then is a post-political politics? It's a politics which excludes the political, a politics which excludes contestation and antagonism, a politics that sets its own boundaries which the boundaries themselves are beyond constitution. The what and the who that gets included within politics is itself beyond contestation. This is not to say that, let's say, there's no contestation within the realm of politics in this sense, but that the realm of politics and what constitutes it is taken beyond constitution. And in this sense, Earth systems governance, despite being let's say, a bold vision for re-articulating and reorganizing politics at a planetary level, is also in some sense a post-political vision for me. It's bound up with existing structures of global power, not just, as Frank indicated, opposing them or changing them. It's bound up with the very processes driving global change, causing the Anthropocene. And there's a risk that rather than challenge these forces, it'll actually serve as a way to channel those. And by not looking towards and giving proper weight to, say, the work of the political, to antagonism, to contestation. So in what follows, got ahead of myself with that slide. In what follows, I'll try to elaborate on this a little in relation to three concerns of political geography. There's many things that go on in political geography, but three that say of the kind of constant themes that run through it. On the one hand, we have the situated nature of knowledge production. Two, kind of geographical imaginaries, particularly in this case around the imaginary of the global. And then thirdly, the relationship between geography and political economy, particularly the effects of global capitalism. And I'll talk to each of those in turn. So firstly, the situated knowledges. And this is the kind of Rory, Rowan 101 slide I almost try and start every class with when I'm teaching undergraduate students, to try and get students to think about the situated nature of geographic knowledge. And in many ways, Earth systems governance discourse is a very broad interdisciplinary field, as we've heard, but it's something which carries with it very particular forms of geographic knowledge, geographic imaginations. I'll come back to that in a second. So many critical geographers emphasize the situated nature of knowledge, the ways in which knowledge is produced in a specific context by specific actors, the ways in which knowledge production is bound up with forms of social power. And this includes those forms of knowledge that claim to be neutral, objective, universal, and so on. So the point is not that all forms of knowledge production are the same, rather that they're specific in each case, but that all, yes, are situated in specific manner in relation to specific contexts, actors, and structures of power. There's a who and a where of knowledge production, which is what power is integral to. And here the influence of feminist and post-colonial scholars of science and technology studies runs deep through my own kind of thinking in this, but certainly in the field of political geography more broadly. These scholars have looked at the ways in which scientific knowledge in particular has been gendered. It's produced by and reproduces gender differences and the product of colonial histories and an agent of colonial power in many senses. And indeed we can think here of the gender role in Earth systems governance context. And here a little, not to wag the finger at myself included, but I don't know if people are aware of this. Congratulations, you have an all-male panel discussion, but it's a move that's operating in various fields to try and address the gender inequality in knowledge production. It's become very important within science technology studies and in geography. But that movement has deeper roots in some of those disciplines and more traction in certain fields than it does in others. Let's say the emerging field around Earth systems governance remains extremely male-dominated. And you can say, okay, this is maybe not the end of the world, but there's a problem here, a problem that is staged here today, including my own participation. I'm not turning that onto the organisers, others. I know they made a genuine effort to take this seriously and invite other people, so on. But it raises questions, and I highlight it just to raise the point of the situated nature of the knowledge production, even that's going on in this room, and the forms of social power that that's a part of. And of course, it's not just gender, there's questions of race, class, cultural, geographic background, and so on. And of course, again, as Frank highlighted this morning, there's been very, very genuine attempts within the Earth Systems Governance Project to be a global platform which involves, and genuinely does involve, scholars from different parts of the world across the globe, and also practitioners working in the field in very many sites. But this remains nonetheless a kind of structural condition of this emerging field. And this raises a really deeper question of what forms of knowledge are legitimate. So it's not just a matter of inclusion and diversity, although this would be expected to be a sort of a minimum. It's not just a matter of expanding the field to let other voices in, but it's a question of what voices are considered legitimate, not just which are included. What forms of knowledge can play a part in Earth systems governance? What are the boundaries of permissible knowledge production which the field has set for itself? Who sets them and by what standard? And how do we compose our research communities, let's say, research collectives? And why a problem? Because it bears not just on how we identify and constitute problems, it does that, but how we might imagine how we would address those problems, how we might, what it is that we're trying to govern. Those questions of what voices are considered legitimate in producing problems bear on those. So what forms of knowledge, what practices are to be given a stake in the defining of problems as well as the defining of modes of addressing those, or solutions, if we will. So Earth systems governance, or as articulated by Frank, privileges natural scientific knowledge. It aims to bring together natural scientific knowledge, policy, expertise, and social science knowledge. But the social science knowledge is always kind of somehow mobilized to provide added value. Social science knowledge is to be integrated, note the word integrated, and integrated up into a framework of natural science, where natural science sets the terms and the frame. Other ways of knowing and doing, perhaps from faith-based knowledges, indigenous cosmologies, all sorts of place-based knowledges of those embedded in changing environments, is to somehow take play second fiddle. So it's not just a matter of integrating those into natural science frame, but contesting the way in which the natural science frame is set, contesting the way in which problems are framed, contesting the ways in which responses are framed. And we can think, in this sense, that Earth systems governance discourse, and the project that Frank leads, it has a kind of situated knowledge which it doesn't really acknowledge. Okay, there's a little gesture made to diversity, a little gesture made to sometimes mentioning the role of the global north without any explanation or expansion. And I'm not sure if that can be considered mere oversight or whether there's assumption that something will be universally valid here. Frank, and I quote from a chapter he had in the conclusion to a recent book called New Earth Politics. Frank says, "The Anthropocene signals the inescapable dominance of the human species. Human societies are no longer reacting to environmental changes and pressures. We are essentially shaping and reshaping our planet." So we may be reshaping and shaping our planet, but the idea that Frank tells us that people are no longer reacting to environmental changes and pressures seems curious to me. I wonder what the people affected by the flooding in Sri Lanka last week might think about that. I wonder what the people of Kiribati, whose lands are disappearing under rising seas, would think about that. I wonder what the people of New Orleans, displaced by Hurricane Katrina a decade ago, would think about that. We can go on and on and on. So rather, Frank offers an example of how we're reshaping the planet, rather than being just, let's say, responding to environmental changes. And he points to a very specific case, the Dutch rewilding project. I'm not sure if I get the name right, the Oostvaarderpersenplassen, which is a nature reserve built in reclaimed land. It's an entirely artificial wild environment, which is a very interesting case. But what interests me about it, in the way Frank mobilized it, is that it's a specific geographic case which is treated as emblematic of the Anthropocene. So suddenly we have this local instance which becomes a figure of the global. I'll come back to this local-global relation. But it's also a specific type of case where nature is the object of control, where humanity creates nature, in fact, or rather even, as Frank himself highlights, the Dutch create nature, not humanity. So who then are the people reshaping the planet? All humanity, those well-resourced and financed, those with access to technology, stable institutions, etc., those well represented around existing tables of international organizations and corporate boardrooms, those least affected by Earth system change, and so on. So the problem, of course, is the distinction between local environmental change and pressures and a global reshaping of the planet is a false one. Both are tied together through structures of power across uneven geographies. Some people are reshaping the planet more than others, as we've heard this morning from Frank and Philippe, but this produces environmental change and pressures for others in specific places. So evoking universal categories such as humanity or even human societies conceals this violence, conceals the operation of power. It puts an abstraction in place of material social processes. And this is a type of knowledge which is, let's say, bound up with structures of global power around the global north. And I do agree with Frank when he says, in some sense, we need to move beyond these kind of very crude geographic imaginaries of the power between the global north and global south. But I would think that would be a work of not dissolving or getting rid of those totally, but trying to move beyond them and make those more complex. These are still important structures. Which brings me to the second point. The geographic imaginaries of the global. So another major concern in critical geography is what we call geographic imaginaries. The ways in which the world is imagined and represented geographically, and the way that these geographic images and representations both reflect social power and produce or are bound up with producing social power. The ways in which they're mobilized to do political work. Perhaps the most common geographic imaginary that we're accustomed to talking about today is that of boundaries or boundary making. We can think of all the discussion of walls, borders, migration, and so on. But another concept, let's say another concern of political geography around geographical imaginaries is the question of scale. So concepts of scale often assume and reproduce hierarchies that are value-laden. So some scales are seen to be more important than others. So we have a kind of scalar hierarchy, for example, running from the local through the regional, the national, the regional, up to the global, where the global is the most important. This is a kind of common structure of political thinking in the post-war period. At least, let's say, political geography thinking of a world politics. And this is a kind of powerful scalar hierarchy which structures Earth systems governance. So the global is always the kind of site in which other scales, other forms of processes need to be integrated up into. So a lot of talk about moving from the local to the global, but the local feeds up into the global. An integrated global view where integration happens upward. The global is always the dominant. So local, perhaps regional knowledges, experiences, practices, problems, solutions, and struggles are useful. They're part of the question here, part of the problem, but they're somehow subservient to the global, or they're effaced altogether. They play second fiddle. So Bierman claims that Earth systems governance requires new paradigms, requires a bold rethinking of the terms, questions, norms, and institutions of political thinking. And of course, to be fair to Frank, he's not claiming to have done this, but he's claiming for the kind of open a space, conceptual space to do that, to be generous to him. And certainly Earth system science, let's say the natural science view which this discourse draws upon, does present a new conception of the Earth. It's a new conception of the way, let's say, the constitutive systems of the Earth operate. But the concept of the global that is mobilized seems to me to be absolutely conventional. It doesn't seem to be affected by a bold rethinking or any new paradigm shift. It's the dominant post-war conception of world politics. And so there's a discussion that we've heard this morning of this 19th century view of the kind of nation state carve up the world. We could send that back centuries, in fact. But this is kind of persists today, granted in new forms, as Philippe pointed, the kind of more than 1940s view of international institutions. But let's say there's a concept of world politics that runs behind that, which runs something like, international politics plus the global economy gives you something like world politics. And now we add complexity into it with all different forms of actors, all different types of processes that we might include in that. But on the other hand, we have this very simple repetition of the idea of the globe, which is divided up into units of certain orders, let's say nation states, and the globe that is also globalized via international institutions, by NGOs, by civil society actors and so on, and global capitalism. So in some sense, Frank points to the ways in which concepts in the natural sciences have histories, and sometimes those histories, they run their course. Those concepts outlive their use, they become a hindrance. They don't help us think our present condition, they don't help us think the normative horizons we might desire for the future. So we can think about the very recent histories of terms like ecology, Earth system, the Anthropocene itself, as we've heard about some today, and the environment, which Frank points out this as being a term which kind of hobbles us in our attempt to try and think the conditions of the Anthropocene or Earth system change. The environment is a term which no longer is fit for purpose. I don't necessarily absolutely agree, but I see his point. And concepts in political thought also have their histories. They also run their course and outlive their use. They also start to, let's say, block us in thinking. And the global, as it is today, is still a relatively recent concept, but it's already one which is extremely very much overdetermined, to use the old Althusserlian phrase. It's a concept that is laden with the kind of, let's say, the post-war conception of interstate geopolitical order and the globalization of the capitalist economy. The global, as is being discussed in political geography, involves, let's say, a certain way of seeing the earth, way of seeing the social relations that constitute it, a certain kind of, let's say, God's eye view, a view that comes from on high. Earth as a space of control and intervention, or at least potentially so. And again, the kind of, let's say, the image world of discussions of the Anthropocene, these images of satellite images of the Earth, this is the view of the Anthropocene. It's not a grounded view of the effects of the Anthropocene, uneven as we've heard they are. It's a view from above. It's the one that always brings the world back together into this global unity. I presume that the point of showing these is to kind of bring us together into this idea of a shared planet. But it's a shared planet seen from above. A shared planet which, let's say, or a view of the shared planet which privileges those with access to traction on the global scale through technology, scientific development, economic and military power, and so on. Others, I would presume, are confined to the merely local. Those who occupy the global can move back and forth freely between the local and the global, whereas those that don't have access to the global, they're just local. So already you see this kind of a globalist scalar hierarchy built into even the images that are shown around the discussion of the Earth system's governance. And the problem I see with this, and how it relates to let's say, the discussion of post-political, is that it fixes politics to one dominant scale. It fixes politics to the global. And this as kind of determines to some degree what is considered legible and what not to be included in the political. It casts, let's say, a net over what might be involved in contestation and what contestations are deemed to be illegitimate outside politics, not to be considered. It fixes where politics properly takes place and who is involved. And the example of the global average temperature of 2 degrees rise, which Frank already pointed to this morning, gives a kind of good case. And I understand that he's also very critical of this global temperature rise. And we see that kind of actually the 2 degree global average is sort of a fantasy figure. There is no point on the Earth which is a global average. There's always specific places where that temperature is not the case. So the global average of 2 degrees, it won't be good for the kind of developed capitalist liberal countries of the global north, but it's going to be catastrophic for countries in the Sahel, say, where that 2 degrees global average will be 3.5, 3.7 degrees temperature rise in already very vulnerable environments. So just an instance of how the effects of the global as a kind of scalar thinking on how we consider politics. So rather, I'd like to say that the political, let's say the contestation antagonism, has no proper scale. In fact, it's something that operates across scales and perhaps disrupts the congealing of power and politics are around certain scales. Fixing the political to one dominant scale, to me, is an attempt to manage and exclude it. Okay? And this brings me to the third and last point. Oh, I missed that. Here we are. So, in some sense, and perhaps in the most radical sense, Earth systems governance is arguably depoliticized in the sense because it is de-economized. Or let's say it lacks a political economy. It's not that there's no discussion of economics, but it lacks a discussion of political economy. It adopts a classic liberal framework that separates the economic and the political out from each other. And now, this is not to say, of course, that if we think of the politics of liberalism, the politics of liberal countries that, such as the UK or Switzerland that I live in, the political discussion concerns almost nothing but the economy, but perhaps sadly reverting into adding in nationalism and kind of all sorts of other things at the minute. But most of political discussion, we think of the UK election cycle, revolves around the economy, distribution, and fairness of distribution, economic growth, taxation policies, and so on. Who's more competent to manage the economy? Who's more competent to manage the debt, manage taxation policy, and so on? But the fundamental terms of the economy itself are beyond contestation. Policy, and let's say politics, concerns itself with tinkering with the best way to organize capitalist growth, but politics cannot question capitalist growth itself. That remains beyond the terms of discussion. And this is something I see reflected very much in Earth systems governance discussion, where the economy is somehow depoliticized, as in it's taken out of contestation. Yes, there's discussion of how it might be reorganized in certain sectors and so on, but the political economy is excluded from politics. Let's say that Earth systems governance sets itself the task of developing better ways to govern the impact of global capitalism on the Earth system without actually addressing global capitalism itself as a problem for governance, or a problem better for politics. The Slovenian, I don't know what you'd call him, cultural theorist, Slavoj Žižek, I'm sure some of you may know him, has this kind of famous line which he is kind of pinched from Frederick Jameson, another cultural theorist, that it's easier today to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, which is kind of something that gets discussed a lot. And in the Earth Systems Governance Project, I see something like a principle running through it, that it's easier to imagine governing the Earth system than it is to imagine governing global capitalism. Think about that. Easier to manage somehow all the complexity that we've heard about than it is to kind of address this elephant in the room somehow, which remains somehow outside political discussion. So there's other ways to think about this. There's a lot of discussion at the minute around the kind of school of thought associated with what's called variously, let's say, various versions of eco-socialism, where global change is understood, where global capitalism and the dynamics of global capitalism are at the heart of global change. In fact, we have this discussion around the naming of the Anthropocene rather than fixing humanity or the anthropos as the kind of somehow responsible subject driving Earth system change. We have rather the Capitalocene, where it's capitalism which drives the Earth system change. Rather than a kind of universal abstraction, the anthropos, which kind of apparently collects all people together, not only living now but in all history, but rather the specific social historical forces of global capitalism. There's a longer tradition in Marxist geography of looking at how the production of global space and the production of nature, so inverted commas, is driven and structured by the dynamics of capital. How capital seeks to establish what David Harvey has famously called spatial fixes for responding to the structural crisis of the search for profit in capital. And these produce contradictory geographic tendencies. On the one hand, a kind of drive towards a globalizing and homogenizing drive. On the other hand, a kind of drive towards differentiation and divisioning up. So global capitalism is something which is at once constantly expanding, seeking new frontiers for extraction, new resources to be commodified, new markets to be opened up, whilst also constantly differentiating along axes of power, producing uneven distribution of wealth, growth, inequality, vulnerability, capacities, and environmental destruction. And of course, we've heard about the uneven way in which different parts of the world and different communities are placed along these axes. So, in conclusion, oh, my last slide is gone. The Big Bang. Anyway, that's I don't know what happened that. The black space, maybe it's a suitable point. So Earth systems governance seeks to seek ways to imagine governing planetary crisis which are more just, more legitimate, and more effective. I think it'll be impossible to do that unless it engages with these concerns: the situated nature of its own knowledge production, the globalist scalar hierarchy that it's still very much embedded within, despite its definite innovations in thinking around what the global is, what constitutes the global, and the structural conditions of global capitalism. Not something which should remain as somehow an elephant in the room, but something which needs to be brought into analysis. It's unclear to me if Earth systems governance lacks the will to do these things. I doubt that. I think it's rather somehow beholden to a kind of pragmatism which risks losing sight of political motivation and sacrificing the strategic vision in order to be recognized as legible within existing modes of global power. So the kind of provocation that I had kind of have at the end was, what would it mean to reimagine radical politics in light of Earth systems change? What would it mean to imagine Earth system change in light of a more radical politics which engages with the situated nature of knowledge production, thinks of other ways to think about the organization of the political in relation to scale and the structural conditions and dynamics of global capitalism? And how might this may help to develop more just, legitimate and effective governance modes for responding to Earth system crisis that Earth systems governance sets itself as a task? Thanks.
Wonderful.